Saray, you may welcome us to the second book club meeting of MERCAZ Reads Israel.
Okay, we're really excited about this program, and we think it's exactly the kind of work that MERCAZ should be doing. That the goal of this program is to give our readers and our members greater insight into what Israelis are thinking today. You can agree or you can disagree, or you can have questions for an author, but the backstory on the book tells you what the person who is, and we choose authors who are living in Israel, what they're thinking about what's happening in Israel today and what issues are on their mind. So we're very excited that Ilana Kurshan agreed to meet with us and to talk to us today. I hope that all of you agree that her book is beautifully written and that it's a really compelling story. So you have information on Ilana's background, but what isn't in the bio is that she's really a product of the conservative movement. She's a graduate of the Schechter School of Long Island. As you know from reading the book, she's the daughter of a conservative rabbi. She's also the granddaughter of a conservative rabbi and the cousin of a conservative rabbi. And she also happens to be the niece of the current chancellor of JTS. So she has very strong background in our movement. So I think we should move on to the questions. And as you have questions, as Howie has said, please share them with us. We're beginning with some of the questions that we received along with the registration, because this is really a book club about the participants. So, Ilana, do you have any opening remarks, or would you like to go straight to the questions?
No, just thank you so much for having me, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you.
Okay, so let's begin with we're putting the questions on the screen. You can all see them. So we have 3 questions on the screen now. What did your parents think of your book?
Well, I think the truth is that they probably had read a lot of it before it was published, because the book began as a series of blog posts that I published initially anonymously on a website. But my parents were among the few people who knew about that website, my parents and close friends. And as I was writing about the Talmud that I was learning, I would post my reflections, and all those reflections ended up becoming sort of the initial version of the book, you could say, or the raw material for what became the book. So my parents were certainly familiar with a lot of the material. Of course, I was very much in touch with them in spite of the geographical distance between them. So they knew what was going on in my life. And in a sense, the book is sort of a reflection of my life. So I don't think there were any surprises. And yeah, I think they're happy that I wrote it, I hope.
We're sure they're happy with all the awards the book received.
Thank you.
So, and the next 2 questions I think we'll ask together. How did you get the idea for the basic plot of the book? And what was your motivation for writing it?
Okay, so the Daf Yomi cycle is a 7.5-year cycle, right? If you learn a page of Talmud a day, you complete the whole Talmud in 7.5 years. And I remember I was approaching the end of my first cycle of Daf Yomi. This must have been about around 7 years ago. I'm approaching now the end of my second cycle, so hence that calculation. I was getting towards the end, and a friend came over, and she said to me, Ilana, you're about to finish your Daf Yomi. What are you going to do to mark the occasion? And I thought to myself, wow, I haven't really thought about that. What should I do? And my friend said to me, you've been doing all this writing. Maybe you should put it all together just so you have a record of everything you've written and everything you've learned. And I thought to myself, wow, that's a really good idea. I should try to do that. So I sat down at my computer thinking this would be something really nice to do if I had any sort of siyum to mark my completion of my learning. And I decided I was going to just go through that blog I had and make a list of all the pieces that I'd written, just sort of, get a sense of what I had. And very quickly it became clear. I learned, when you learn Daf Yomi, you learn through the Talmud tractate by tractate. And so I had written about each tractate. And in my writing about each tractate, I wrote about what was going on in my life when I learned that tractate. So I wrote down everything I had, and essentially it was organized by tractate, and it was sort of a chronicle of my journey, my personal journey, and my journey as a student of Talmud over the course of the last 7.5 years, with the Talmud sort of being kind of like the soundtrack for my life, or the backdrop, the scenery, choose your metaphor. And when I looked at that screen, I said to myself, wow, basically what this is, I don't know if I thought of it as a book, but a long essay maybe, where every section is one another tractate in the Talmud. So the shape of the book very much suggested itself. I don't think I had to come up with that. Wait, I'm sorry, what was the second question? And
Your motivation. Your
Oh,
motivation.
and the motivation for writing the book was, okay, so for writing the book, it was very much wanting to have a way of reflecting on what I learned, wanting to put everything together, and also wanting to have a good excuse to go back and do chazara, to review what I had learned, take stock of my journey through the Talmud. But that was very different from publishing. When I wrote it, when I put it together, I had no intention at the time of ever publishing it when I compiled my writing. It was more just, let me see what I have. And I think had I thought about publishing the book at the time, I would never have been able to, number one, write some of the things I wrote, because a lot of the book is very personal, and I wasn't writing it thinking with a broad audience in mind. And I also think, I don't think I would have been comfortable sharing a lot of what I wrote in the book. And I remember when I put the whole manuscript together, and it became clear that basically what I had, I think it was something like 90,000 words, was basically a book-length manuscript. I realized, wow, I could do something with this. I could publish this. And I kept asking myself, is the writing good enough to justify everything that I'm sharing, right? Is it really worth it? Because for me, always those literary and aesthetic considerations trump everything, right? Like I'm willing to share something if it's really, really articulate and witty, then maybe I'll share it even if it's really personal. So that was kind of the calculation in my head. But even so, I was very, very wary of sharing it with anyone. I distinctly remember there was one Pesach when I looked it over and said, do I dare to send this to my boss? I work for a literary agency. And I thought, no, I'm going to revise it a little more. Maybe I'll think about it maybe in another week or two. And I remember the next Pesach asking the same question. I'm thinking, wait a second, I remember last year in Pesach I asked this, which is to say that for at least a year it sat in the drawer. So the publishing was quite another question. And then when I finally did share it with my agent, and then we started searching for a publisher, I really, really kept saying to myself, you know what, if someone decides that it's good enough to publish, then I'll publish it. And if no one thinks it's good enough to publish, then I'll just forget about it. And the day the book sold to a publisher, it took a long time. The day it actually sold to a publisher, I'll never forget, was the same day that my daughter was born. And I remember this because I was in the hospital in the delivery room when my agent called to tell me that she had an offer for the book from St. Martin's Press. And I remember my husband said to me, don't answer the phone. You're in labor. Don't answer the phone. And I said to him, I have to answer the phone. And he said to me, I know. People often analogize writing a book to having a baby, but you don't have to do them both at the same time. So I'll always remember when the book sold. It was exactly 4.5 years ago, because that's how old my daughter is. Anyway, that's my publication story.
That's quite a story. Okay.
Yeah, but I'll just add to that, like, in a way it's not coincidental, because I really do mark time based on what I was learning at certain points in my life. So my twins, the twins I read about in the book, are now 7.5, and I recently told them we are now in the middle of Masechet Eruvin. We recently finished Masechet Shabbat, and they were born on one of the last dapim of Masechet Shabbat. And I told them on the day we learned the daf, because now I'm doing my second cycle, I said, this is the day you were born. This is the anniversary of the day you were born, which might not make no sense to someone else, because, the anniversary of the day you're born is your birthday. It wasn't their birthday. It was 7.5 years after. But for me, it was sort of like the first anniversary, because it was the first time we were coming to the daf they were born again. So I really do mark time in the pages I've learned. So in a way, that coincidence is sort of nice, but not so unusual. Yeah.
So, I read the book and I started learning Daf Yomi, and I have to say it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. So I am in awe of the fact that you could not only manage to go through a daf a day, but that you could write about it and take notes on it. That's incredible. So having completed the Daf Yomi cycle once, you're doing it again. So
Yeah.
Are you finding it different the second time? Are you learning different pieces? Are you focusing on different pieces? Or do you find that it really matches, what you thought about it the first time?
Okay, so I think it's very different the second time. It's different because I'm different, I would say, above all. Sometimes people say to me, what, you're doing Daf Yomi again? Didn't you already finish the Gemara? And, I definitely feel like, you certainly could spend many, many lifetimes learning Talmud and never exhaust, hence the title of the book, right? Never exhaust all there is to learn. But I hear things differently. I notice things different the second time around. Sometimes it will happen to me that I'll be listening to a podcast without the Gemara open in front of me, and I'll hear something and say, oh, that's such a good point. I should go write that down. And I open the Gemara to take a note, and I see that 7.5 years ago I made the exact same note. So, sometimes it's different because, I forget. And in a way, I think that forgetting is in some ways really a virtue when it comes to learning. They say it's a good thing because since you forget, you're always able to learn something new and experience that pleasure of rediscovery. Actually, there's a midrash in Kohelet Rabbah where Solomon says, it's one of my favorite midrashim. He says, he says that the way to learn is basically the best way to learn is to empty yourself out and forget and then relearn again. It's from midrash on the pasuk, upaniti ani ladat chokhmah, and he says, don't read paniti ela piniti. Don't read I turned to know wisdom, but rather I emptied myself out, piniti. I emptied myself out so as to acquire wisdom, because the way to learn is to forget and then relearn. So in a way, right, part of the joy is the pleasure of rediscovering everything I forgot. But also I find new things and the text speaks to me in different ways. So I can just give you one example from something that happened to me yesterday morning. So I have 3 kids now who are in Zoom school, like doing we're in a lockdown here in Israel, for those of you who aren't in Israel. So all the schooling is on Zoom. And it's very hard because, multiple kids are calling to me like, Ema, what does this mean? Ema, my Zoom disconnected. Oh no, I can't figure out how to get on. And I don't know, what does this mean? And what's 11 minus 7? And you name it, everything. And in Eruvin, in the Dapim we're learning right now, it's all about how far a person can walk on Shabbat. How far, can you go beyond the place where you're Konesh Shvita, where you're sort of establishing yourself on Shabbat. How much further afield can you go? You are allowed to go 2,000 amot, that's the distance. But there are all these considerations. Can you extend that? Does it depend on what kind of space you're in, and they talk about someone who is kind of pulled in 2 directions based on where they put their eruv, where they put their food before Shabbat, that sort of represents where they're going to be, and they say there's this phrase that someone who's sort of pulled in 2 directions is like a chamar gamal. It's like a donkey driver and a camel driver, because apparently one of those animals is led from the front and one of those animals is led from behind, such that a person cannot simultaneously lead a donkey and a camel. And so yesterday when I was trying to run from one Zoom to the other Zoom and help everyone, I was like, Hareza chamar gamal. I really feel like I'm being pulled in all directions. So, and that's a metaphor that I did underline that metaphor last time I learned, but I underlined it because I don't know how it spoke to me then. It must have meant something very different to me. And certainly it wasn't about, Zoom schooling children, because I didn't have any school-age children the last time I learned that source. So that's some of the fun, using the metaphors in different ways each time I learn. I sort of think it's a bit like, we read the same parshiot every year, right? We finish the Torah as we're about to do and start again with Breshit. And you could say, well, why read the same parshiot again and again? Didn't you finish the Torah? And the point is, right, every year when we every year when we read the Parshat Shul, we hear new things, new parts of new psukim speak to us, new ideas speak to us. We come up with new insights because we're different. And that's really how the Daf Yomi experience has been for me. Yeah.
So with your background coming from a conservative synagogue and your education, how do you accept the sexism of orthodoxy? This came from one of our participants.
So I don't accept the sexism of orthodoxy. I think this is a simple answer. But if you mean, I'm not sure about the question. Maybe the question is, how do I relate to the way the Talmud treats women? Perhaps, I can speak to that. I don't know. I don't accept the sexism of orthodoxy. I can say that my personal preference is, whenever possible, to daven in an egalitarian minyan when I can. I can say a lot more about that, but I don't know if this is so relevant. But when it comes to the way that women in the Talmud are treated. Obviously, orthodoxy would be completely anachronistic, I'm assuming that's sort of what the question is getting at. I really view the women in the Talmud as kind of like dinosaurs, like an extinct species. Like, they seem so foreign from the women that I know today, in the sense, in so many ways, right? In terms of, their utter dependence on men, that they have to basically be living in either their father's home or their husband's home. Otherwise, they're really, left with no economic recourse, with rare exceptions. That women were not expected or encouraged to learn Torah. I feel like being a woman in the 21st century, being a Jewish woman in the 21st century, is like the most exciting time to be a Jewish woman. And I feel really grateful that I am able to have the experiences both of bearing children and studying the whole Talmud, and doing that simultaneously sometimes. It's almost like, I think about the brachot we say in Birkot HaShachar, right? That originally it was Shelo Asani Isha, and then that was changed to, right, in more progressive Sidurim, it becomes like Shasani Kirtzono, that God made me according to God's will, and then Shasani Bitzalmo, that God made me in God's image. That bracha sort of evolved, right? Because there was obvious discomfort with Shelo Asani Isha. Although sadly in my kids' school they still say it, but alas, we correct it at home. But I'll say, when I think about that bracha often, like I've had many moments in my life where what I've wanted to say instead of that bracha is Baruch She'asani Isha. Like, I feel so grateful that I was born a Jewish woman today, because I feel that I am that I and all Jewish women who study Torah today are uniquely positioned to come up with insights that our tradition has not been privy to until this point, and that's very exciting.
Okay, I'm told I skipped a question on the last slide, which was sometimes you include the Mishnah and sometimes you don't. And is there
in the book, you mean? In the book,
yeah,
sometimes
in the book,
I quote the Mishnah?
and sometimes you don't.
In the book, I would really quote whatever I felt was relevant to whatever I was discussing. The Talmud includes, right, both the Mishnah and the discussion of the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is essentially the oldest parts of the Talmud. So when the Mishnah was relevant to whatever I was discussing in the book, I would discuss the Mishnah. I would say what I teach at the conservative yeshiva, and I teach rabbinic Agadah. And when I teach Agadah, I really do try as much as possible to always give the context and the Mishnah that Gemara is based on, that the Agadah is based on. I think it's very helpful to be rooted in the Mishnah, and part of what I love about Daf Yomi is that you see all the sources in context, right? You can learn, there's stories that you can learn hundreds of times out of context, but you come up with such different insights when you learn them in context, in light of the Mishnah that precedes it. I remember, like, at several points encountering the story about I won't go into detail, but there are many examples I can give, but all they're sort of complicated. But that is to say that learning Gemara in the context of the Mishnah makes for a very different experience. So when I teach, it's very important to me to always try to give the Mishnaic context. Yeah, I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
So I just want to add a comment that came from my colleague, Rabbi Jennifer Gorman, who is the director of MERCAZ Canada. And she writes that there's a great version in a Siddur in the JTS library in the Rare Book Room that says, "Thank you, God, for making me a woman and not a man."
From when? Oh, I'll have to ask that. Okay.
But
okay.
But that is there is such a bracha in a volume in the JTS Rare Book Room.
Wow.
So we'll have to find out more about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a question here from David Reifler, who is a member of the MERCAZ board. And he writes that as a newcomer to Daf Yomi since January and a person in the 20th year of a second marriage, that he very much identifies with your story as reflected in 3 related questions. So they are: how does your masterful addition of Talmud to your internalization of romantic literary sources contribute to your faith, and how does it present challenges? Do you want all 3 questions at once? Or one
Oh,
of the
good. Now I can see the questions. I just managed to switch that. That's great. Okay. And no, I can see the questions. So no, that's
Good.
good. Okay, so definitely, I would say that when I study Talmud, I bring all my passions to bear on the text, and I think that's. I've always been a very interdisciplinary learner. In high school, I used to write poetry, rhyming poetry about math. Um, like I'm always sort of thinking out of the box. I majored in history of science in college because it was the one way I could think of to do the sciences and the humanities and combine the two and see how these two disciplines speak to one another. And Daf Yomi was no different. I'd be studying Talmud and I would be thinking about other sources that I love and have studied. So I'd be reading, I mean, I think, yeah, I talk about this in the book about, oh, I know. Here's one: the cure for leprosy, right? In Masechet Ketubot, Chazal, the rabbis talk about what happens if someone is a Baal Ratan, like some sort of skin disease, some sort of leprous skin disease. What is the cure for it? And they explain you have to create this very elaborate concoction involving like a clover leaf and a lizard leg or whatever. And I read this and I thought to myself, oh, this reminds me of the cauldron scene in Macbeth, right? So I'm always having these. I'm always making connections between. The Talmud is always reminding me of other literatures, so I think that definitely affected my reading. And often when I was studying Talmud, I'd jot down in the margins, oh, this reminds me of this poem and this reference. And when I teach Agadah, I very, very often in my classes bring poetic intertext, sometimes literary intertext. Like I actually just recently translated a whole short story because I realized that it was actually a reworking of a rabbinic Agadah. Very, very subtle, but it was clear to me that that's what the author, an Israeli author, that's what the author was doing. So I translated the story so that I could include it on my source sheet, like as a further reading thing. So I'm always bringing these texts together, and I think that. Being a sort of hopeless romantic, I guess, I was very taken by the unfulfilled longing in the Talmud, which I really see as a longing for a nostalgic longing for the Beit HaMikdash. For the temple as it once was, very relevant as Yom Kippur is approaching. Masechet Yoma, the tractate that deals with Yom Kippur in the Talmud, is 7/8 of it. 7 of the 8 chapters are about everything the high priest did in the Beit HaMikdash, right, on Yom Kippur, sort of following in the footsteps of the Kohen Gadol. Right, only the last chapter is about, Inui Nefesh, right? All the things we have to do on Yom Kippur, like fasting and all the ways we deprive ourselves because of the holiness of the day. Most of it's about the temple. And it very much felt to me like the Talmud was sort of the rabbi's post-traumatic stress response to the Churban, to the destruction of the temple. And so I read the Talmud that way. It's a sort of nostalgic, romantic longing for something that had been very, very meaningful and powerful and symbolic, and something that the vast majority of the rabbis never knew firsthand, but had only heard stories about, which only further contributed to how awe-inspiring and legendary and how it was. So the romanticism was very much a part of my study of Talmud. But yes, but I also felt that, I'm looking at all these questions. The last question, I also felt it was very much, my learning was always also very integrated into my life, in the sense that the text was furnishing me with metaphors for processing my daily experiences. First as a newly divorced person, then as a dating woman, married, pregnant, a mother of young children, now a mother of school-aged children. The text has been as much a part of my sort of abstract intellectual romanticizing as it has been a part of my day-to-day routine, I guess you could say.
Okay. Howie? Okay, here we are. So what are some of, now let's talk about what it meant to be living in Israel as you were doing this, and some of the issues that you raise in the book. So what are some of the culture shocks that you encountered? And actually, when we spoke the other day, you talked about how you really didn't have so many culture shocks because of the way you found yourself living in Israel. That you said you came, you didn't know how long you were staying.
Right.
And then you stayed.
Right. Yeah. I don't think I had a particularly dramatic or traumatic aliyah, because I came to Israel thinking I was just coming for an academic year, and sort of ended up staying, and it took a while. It was at least a few years before I made Aliyah, and even my Aliyah was rather anticlimactic because it was just a matter of my boss saying, like, look, you really need to be a citizen. We can't process your next paycheck unless you're a citizen. You have to go to the Ministry of the Interior and register as a citizen, otherwise you're not going to get paid. So I dutifully went to the Ministry of Interior and registered as a citizen, and it was sort of like a matter of waiting a long time and filling out forms. It wasn't anything more significant than that to me, really. And I also never felt like, I think I write about this in the book, that I was very wary in the time of my life when I started learning Daf Yomi. I was very wary of making long-term commitments, my marriage just having dissolved. So the Aliyah too wasn't something that I saw as, something I was sort of leaping into. It didn't feel like anything like that. It was very gradual. And I also, I think, I wouldn't say that I've had so many culture shocks. I suppose I was very lucky that when I first started living in Israel, I was part of a minyan, a fully egalitarian minyan that I helped run with some friends, which was not all that different from the prayer communities I had been a part of before I made Aliyah. And although it's true that minyan was made up of primarily Americans, not exclusively, but primarily, and it was hard for me to see how un-indigenous egalitarian Judaism is in Israeli soil, how hard it has been to take root here. That was hard for me. I also discovered that a lot of the assumptions I had taken as a given, particularly related to feminism, were not taken as a given by many of the people I encountered. I work for Lilith magazine as the book reviews editor, and I always have extra copies of Lilith, and I'm always trying to, I say, because it's a feminist magazine, I shouldn't say disseminate, but I'm always trying to, give them to people who I think would appreciate them. And I remember one time I had a friend from the pool, an older woman. I said to her, "Oh, you have to read this magazine. It's wonderful. I think you'd really love it. It's a Jewish feminist magazine." And she looked at me like I was handing her like a sheretz, like, something completely impure. And she's like, "What? Feminist? I'm not a feminist." So she wouldn't touch it. And I thought to myself, like, I don't understand. Like, how do you think that, like, how do you think that you got to where you are today in your professional life? She had a very successful career. If not for feminism and all the ways in which your life is indebted to feminism, how can you not be a feminist? I didn't engage her at the time, but that for me was what that really took me aback. I'll say also, I mean, this is obvious, but I think one thing that really helped with my Aliyah was technology, was being able to remain in close touch with my family abroad, because of, Zoom and not, then it wasn't Zoom, but what a Skype, I guess, all the ways it was so easy to feel present even from a distance. I think one of the hardest periods has been now when my children haven't been able to see their grandparents for a long time, which is, it's in person, which has been really hard. But I didn't feel that distance initially, because I did go back a lot for visits. I don't know. I guess I'm very lucky. I sort of took everything as an adventure, and I remember, like, yes, it was very annoying to me that, on Thursday nights when you go to the supermarket, you can wait in line for over an hour. And I remember finding that really frustrating, how inefficient a lot of things are here. But that, for me, that was just an opportunity to reframe. And I remember I said to myself, okay, the supermarket could be really annoying if you go thinking that you're going to the supermarket to buy groceries. From now on, I'm going to tell myself, I am going to go find a great place to read my novel standing up for an hour where I won't be distracted. I'll do it on the supermarket line. And I would really tell myself I was going to the supermarket to read for an hour. And I would go, get all my groceries, stand in line, open my book, and just read. And then when I reframed it, like, it wasn't such a pain in the neck anymore, So I guess I think I went into it maybe with a good attitude. I don't know. I don't know if that's yeah.
One of the most striking things in your book, or at least I found striking, was the story about taking your son to school before Shavuot and his needing his basket.
Oh,
And
right. I forgot about that. That's a good answer. I could have answered like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right.
The bikurim. Yeah, my kids still remind me about that. Yeah.
And, and what was interesting was that there were a lot of American Olim who posted on Facebook just before the schools opened about the trauma of buying school supplies for their children and not understanding exactly what it was that they needed.
Oh, that was also traumatic for me, for sure, for sure. I'm always asking my kids about, like, what is this? Exactly. Like, is this a protractor? Is this a compass? Like, I don't get it. For sure, for sure. There's something called a misulash catalogi, which is basically, I don't even know the word in English. It's like a, no, it's a standing file that you put papers in, standing up. But it kind of translates like literally to like a catalog triangle, I guess. It doesn't really make sense. And I had no idea what this thing was, no idea. And it took so long for me to actually figure it out that like they had to bring one the next day, and we ended up just cutting out a cornflakes box in the shape of this, because like when I finally figured out what it was too late to go get it, and like my kids were like, we need it the next day. So yeah, I've definitely had those. I've certainly had those traumas as well. I guess I've blocked it all out, but yeah, there were a lot of translation issues, but all of those things have also been a source of great pleasure. Like for me, one of my favorite things to do is to write down all the funny things my kids say, in their games with translation. Like the way you say in Hebrew that something got lost, you say that it literally like went to like lostness. So my kids, it went to being lost kind of. So a lot of times my daughter will say to me like, I can't find my toy, or I can't find my doll. It went to Hebrew, like literally translating the syntax of the Hebrew. And I try to remember to write all those things down because I don't want to forget. I don't want to forget. So the same things that are a source of frustration are also a source of pleasure, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, so we have lots of new questions, and we have some of the agreed upon questions. So, well, let's go with this one. What are the discontinuities that you encounter between studying Talmud and living in Israel today? And do you think it would have been different if you had done Daf Yomi in the United States?
I find that living in Israel, I find living in accordance with the rhythm of the Jewish calendar has been very, very meaningful for me and very fruitful for me in terms of my thinking and my writing. It feels much more I don't know, sort of. It feels like it's my rhythm that I'm living in according with. I wrote in the book about what it's like to have a work week where Friday is the day off instead of Sunday, and how I love that schedule so much more. I love having my day off be about getting ready for Shabbat. I love having the kids home so we can get ready for Shabbat together. When I make Havdalah, I really do like knowing that tomorrow it's back to work. And Saturday night Saturday night is always like that frenzied night of like getting ready for the week, figuring out the schedule, who's doing what, when do we need a babysitter, like all that logistical stuff. It all happens right after Havdalah, which is a real like mavdil ben kodesh l'chol. It's not about, okay, Shabbat is over, now we have this weird Sunday thing. I never liked Sundays. I always got very depressed on Sundays. I always felt like this day of like, I always thought I would be able to do everything on Sundays and ended up never getting anything done and feeling very empty at the end. Whatever. So I'm very happy to be rid of Sundays. That's clear to me. And I love the energy of Fridays. I love the way the atmosphere, certainly in Jerusalem, really shifts midday on Friday, where Friday morning everyone's out and about running errands. I mean, not right now when we're in a lockdown, but in normal times. That should return speedily. When everyone's out and about and busy and getting ready for what they're going to need for Shabbat, and then the afternoon when suddenly the streets are empty and everything gets very quiet, and you really feel sort of that the serenity of Shabbat beginning to descend, and by the time the siren goes off announcing the start of Shabbat, which is the equivalent of what the Talmud describes as, right, there were shofarot that were sounded for the start of Shabbat in the time of the Talmud. We have sirens now. You really feel like you're really accepting upon yourself the Shabbat, that it's not just I remember in America, it always like Shabbat crashed into me like a train speeding headlong into me. I was just telling the kids actually, because we were talking about Yom Kippur and getting ready for Yom Kippur and how it's actually a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. It's not just a mitzvah to fast on Yom Kippur, it's a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. And I was telling the kids that the story that I remembered from when I worked at, when I used to work at Random House. I remember there was one, it was an Erev Yom Kippur, and I was at work, and I realized it was almost time for Kol Nidre, and I left the office, and I didn't have any time to eat. And I remember I had a bag of pretzels in my backpack, and that's what I ate. I didn't have any water, and I spent the whole fast like so thirsty because I had like my Sudam Afseket had been a bag of pretzels, like salty pretzels. And to my kids, like they couldn't relate to this, but it was really like, that was my memory of sort of that discontinuity between like the schedule of the world around me and the schedule of the Jewish calendar that my heart was pulsing to. And here in a way, I feel much more at home because of that. I feel very, very fortunate that, you walk into the stores, before Purim, and all you find is like the little chocolate bars because they're good for mishloach manot, and like little packages of pre-packaged dried fruit for mishloach manot and what have you. Like, it's like the whole country is living in the Jewish calendar as it is. So that's very meaningful for me. And I think, look, the text of the Talmud, I'm very intrigued by the tensions between the land of Israel and the diaspora within the Talmud, right? I study the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which, as opposed to the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of the land of Israel, there's a lot of tension between the Jewish community in the land of Israel and the Jewish community in Bavel. There's even stories, there's a famous story at the end of Tubot about a rabbi who forbids his student from making aliyah, tells the student, you're not allowed to move to the land of Israel, right? I forbid you, and the center of Torah learning is in Bavel. Don't you think it's in Eretz Yisrael? We have better yeshivot here in the diaspora. Don't you dare make aliyah. There was a lot of tension and rivalry, and the scholars in the land of Israel really had to fight for their hegemony and their authority. And I find that fascinating in light of the polarities between the Jewish community today, the American Jewish community, the Israeli Jewish community. So I think reading this text as a citizen of Israel and as someone who's been studying texts in Israel now for over a decade, I definitely think that I read the Talmud in different ways. There's a great story also about, the rabbis are always coming up with these sort of outlandish situations to try to test, any generalization, like where can you find an exception? So there's a story about, what if someone, right, it comes up, what if someone forgets that they're in the Beit HaMikdash and they bring a korban that they're not allowed to bring, or they go to a place in the Beit HaMikdash they're not allowed to go, right? Because there's certain sections of the Beit HaMikdash that, depending on whether you're a Kohen or Israel, how far you're allowed to enter, right? Don't go beyond this point. And someone goes too far and they say, well, maybe he was from Bavel and he didn't know he was in the Beit HaMikdash because he didn't know his way around, which is like totally ridiculous and another way of kind of bashing the Babylonians. But anyway, all these stories always really fascinate me. And I pay careful attention to them.
So can you talk a little bit, you started before about talking about how you found a minyan that was egalitarian, and we also have a question about defining what it means to be egalitarian in Israel, if it's truly equal, if women read from the Torah, and if a woman can be a shaliach tzibor. But what did it take for you to find your niche? And also, how are your children dealing with that? What kind of school are they in? And you're a feminist. I would assume you're raising your daughters to be feminists and you're raising your sons to be egalitarian. So can you talk a little bit about that in Yerushalayim? What's that like?
So I spoke about the minyan that I davened in when I first made Aliyah. In a way, maybe that was kind of like my training wheels, sort of smooth the transition for me. And it was, when I got married, so my husband grew up in an Orthodox home, and when we first got married, we would daven in different minyanim. He would daven, generally he would daven at the kotel very, very early in the morning, vatikin. And I would go to an egalitarian minyan like 2 or 3 hours later. And that was just our routine. And that was completely fine because in Israel, certainly in Jerusalem, your religious community is not, your prayer community is not your social community. And you know, you inevitably will pass like several other shuls on the way to your shul. So that was fine. It was a little more complicated when we had kids, and both of us wanted to daven. And I remember, like, it was still very important to me when my kids were young to daven in an egalitarian minyan, but it became increasingly difficult because the only egalitarian minyan that was close enough to us was still a considerable distance, and we were schlepping, you know, like my son who was 2 in the baby carrier, the twins were just born in a double stroller, and every Shabbat, you know, we would set out to this minyan, and it was a good, I don't know, 35-minute walk. I don't know, which for Jerusalem is really far to walk to shul. And, you know, you have at least 1 or 2 shuls on your block, so you know, so we'd be walking, and my husband would kind of, you know, like grudgingly like count all the shuls we were passing and not going to along the way, as the kids were getting increasingly upset and it was hot or whatever. And it started to, every week the kids would sort of collapse, and we just go into this one shul, because it was like where the kids collapsed, and they always collapse in the same place. Anyway, P.S. like 10 years later, that's our shul. It really is our shul because that's where the kids collapsed. It happens to be a partnership minyan. It's not a fully egalitarian minyan. But the reason I ended up davening there is because I think I sort of broadened my sense of what egalitarianism means when I became a parent. And what I mean by that is that egalitarian minyan that was a 35-minute walk away happened to be up 3 flights of stairs. And there was no, I had a double stroller and a baby carrier, which meant that if I went there alone without my husband, I couldn't even get into the shul, right? My double stroller didn't even fit through the door. So even though this was a shul that was so welcoming of me as a woman, it was a shul that I physically couldn't get into, whereas this other minyan, which is the minyan we kind of crashed in front of, had a ramp. And the ramp was wide, and there was space, you know, there was a wide door to the place where we davened. If in America you'd call it a sanctuary, but I don't think I could call this room a sanctuary, but anyway, I guess it is, I don't know. The room we davened in. And I brought my double stroller, which meant that if one twin was asleep and one was awake, I didn't have to be like, oh no, what do I do? Do I leave the stroller inside? Or right? I just brought the stroller in, you know, it was no, do I wake the baby? And I guess egalitarian came to mean, to my mind, right, the place where I, as a woman, am guaranteed that I'll be able to daven, right? And that may not be a place where I could lead all the tefillot that I'd want to lead, right? Or where women are doing all the things I want women to do. But in a way, it was egalitarian in a different way in terms of its accessibility, in terms of the way, I'm talking about Shira Chadasha, by the way, in case you remember what's the name of the minyan. And what I really love about this community is that it's a community that really works to make everyone feel welcome, regardless of their life situation. Whether you're a single mother or, you know, a person who never got married or whatever it is, wherever you are in life, a recent widow, whatever you are, right? It's a place where the community really, really embraces you. And again, I think that's my experience, at least, you know, I think that's a broader definition of what it means for all people to be equal. As you know, as I fervently believe we all are, like that's very much my sort of religious sensibility, that, you know, we're all created b'tselem Elokim, and we're all, you know, we all are, you know, infinite. We all have infinite worth, and I think that this community very much recognizes that. You know, I will also add that you know, part of what's been hard is, you know, one of my greatest pleasures. I really love to learn. I love to read from the Torah. I do read from the Torah at Shira Chadasha, and when I do, I always bring up my kids with me to the Amud, and, you know, my kids hold the yad in between aliyot. They stand on a stool next to me. The fact that this is a shul that tolerates that, and indeed actually invites that, is also part of what makes that minyan feel very much a home to me. But you know, there have been moments, certainly now in this lockdown, where I can't get my kids to shul. We've been davening in the park outside our house, and actually we're now in quarantine. We can't leave the house for 2 weeks because we were exposed to someone with corona. And so we weren't allowed to leave the house on Rosh Hashanah, so none of us could go to shul. But we were very fortunate. We actually heard several minyanim from our porch, and my kids my kids were counting how many times we heard shofar. I think they counted like we heard 500 kolot, which is like much more than we ever would have heard had we been in shul, right? 5 times more. So, I think that's one of the beauties of living in Jerusalem is right, that you don't have to leave your house to hear shofar. I feel like I'm talking too long. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I'm happy to go on.
Finding it interesting. That we're finding interesting to hear what your thinking is.
Yeah. I think the only thing I'll say is that it would be very hard for me to have to make my home in a prayer community where I couldn't read from the Torah and where my kids didn't see me reading from the Torah on a regular basis. And one of my greatest joys of the whole period of this pandemic was we've been davening as a family at home. And my kids bring the nusach of the tefillah they hear in school, and sometimes we correct things they say that I do that I don't necessarily agree with in terms of the way they do the tefillah. But there was one Shabbat morning where they I think I did this a few times. They sort of set up their own Torah service where we have these bar stools. They put 2 of the bar stools together and put a chumash on top and covered it with a little doll blanket. And we have a yad. They took out the yad and they had me read each of the aliyot, and they gave out the aliyot amongst each other, and got called up for the aliyot. And for me, the fact that, and there was no sense of oh, but a woman has to do this, a man has to do this. They had no sense of that whatsoever. And I feel like that's really important to me. It's very important to me that my kids grow up thinking that everything that men can do, women can do, certainly in the ritual sphere. And I really, really try to emphasize that to them. And a lot of times when we're learning things out of their school textbooks, we're always adding, caveats, we're always qualifying, right? We're always explaining to them, wait a second, yes, this is what the book says, but actually this is what we believe, and this is why we believe this, and what have you. So yeah, there are moments of tension and dissonance, but that makes life interesting.
So as we're looking through the questions, you've actually answered some of the ones going forward.
Okay.
So, okay, so let's go to this one. You talk in the book about there being a lack of anonymity in Jerusalem, that you kept bumping into people. It kind of felt more like a small town, or actually a place where the Jewish community gathers. And I think many of us have had that experience in Yerushalayim, where you keep bumping into people, or at least I think some of us have had this, from different places in your lives, and that they just keep appearing. Do you think this is unique to Jerusalem?
No, not unique to Jerusalem, but in terms of being the capital of Israel, and in a way sort of like the Jewish capital of the world in that way, I guess, a place that attracts so many Jews from all over the world. There's this sort of sense that you can kind of stay here and never move, and end up seeing everyone you ever want to see if you just, never move. It's funny because now Yom Kippur is approaching, and I think there's this will obviously be different this year, but in general there's a I guess we can call it kind of like a minhag that after Kol Nidre on Leil Yom Kippur, everyone goes out in the streets and just walks the streets, and it's very, very beautiful. I almost imagine it like people are sort of gliding along like angels. Everyone's dressed in white. Everyone's in this sort of elevated spiritual state, having just sat through Kol Nidre, with Yom Kippur upon us. There's a sense of sort of majesty and sanctity, and you walk through the streets and you really do see everyone is out in the streets. It's just a very, very, very special moment. Also Yom Kippur in Jerusalem is a very, very festive day, right? There's a real sense, the metaphor I always think of, you have the sense on Yom Kippur here. I never had the sense in America. In America, I always thought Yom Kippur was this super serious and terrifying day. And there is that gravity, but here in Yom Kippur, it's kind of like that feeling when you've worked really, really, really hard on your senior thesis, let's say, and you turn it in and you're done. And it's yes, it's done. And you don't know your grade yet, but you know that you've submitted it, which means you're not going to be studying anymore. You're not going to be writing anymore. It's off your desk. That's the feeling on Yom Kippur. We've been working so hard all through Elul on our tshuva. We've been doing all this spiritual work, and you know what? now it's just up to God. We don't know what grade we're going to get, but you feel that relief in the streets of like, that's like everyone is giving this like massive exhalation. You know, you can't do that during a pandemic, I know, but that's really the feeling, and it's very, very powerful. And I love that. I love that lack of anonymity. I really love it. Sort of running into everyone, seeing everyone, and sort of experiencing that sanctity as a community. And I'll really miss that this year. I'm also really going to miss. I've been ever since I had young children. I've one of my favorite. I go to slichot every night. You know, in Elul and between Rosh Hashanah during a Aseret Yemei Tshuva, because I really can't concentrate in shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Like, the likelihood that I'll have quiet during any of the hours of shul and the ability to focus with the kids, it's very, very slim. So I tend to like do most of that sort of serious, intensive prayer and introspection. I do it at 10:30 at night at slichot. And I love the melodies of slichot, but I missed it. I was able to go for the beginning, but then we got into quarantine, so I really missed that. Well, that's not answering your question at all. Sorry. Anonymity. I think I could feel that anywhere, in any big city, but definitely more so in Jerusalem. And sometimes it does bother me. I never like to sit like in the front of a cafe. I never like being seen, without knowing that I'm being seen. Yeah, that's just my personality. But I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, that continues. That's still an issue for me, I guess, is the short answer.
So actually, in your discussion, you've addressed many of the questions that have been raised. And I think
education, yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little?
Sure, yeah, so no, I think about this a lot, the different kinds of education. Well, okay, now, yeah, I was thinking, like, now that we're in lockdown, my husband has been reading Othello to my kids and like explaining every line with them. And they've been sticking with it because he promised them that if they get through the whole play, they can watch a movie version. So like they're really into it now. But anyway, that is to say, we're always trying to sort of fill in the gaps, fill in what we think they're not getting in school. My twins have just started reading in English now, finally, after we worked on it for a very long time. And they're just starting to be able to read to themselves in English. And I see, like, now that they're reading these books that we got from my sister who has kids, school-age kids in America, I see how many of the cultural references they just completely miss. Like, I just explained to them tonight at bedtime the Pledge of Allegiance. Like, they had never heard of that before. Why should they have heard of it, right? But anyway, like things like that. And actually, they did. The funny thing is, they were like, "Oh, that's the part. It's from the part in Ramona where she doesn't know what the Donzer is." I'm not going to explain that, but if you got the reference, Hamivin Yavin. But anyway, they ended up realizing they actually knew what it was because we had read Ramona. But anyway, that is to say, there's a lot. We're always trying to, we have a lot of cultural assumptions, a lot that we take as a given because of our background that for our kids is very different, and vice versa. I feel like my kids are so lucky that they're in what's essentially like a public school. That is to say, like the neighborhood school. Our school is a 5-minute, it's around the corner from our house. Our kids walk to school. They don't have to cross any streets to get to school. We feel very, very lucky about that. That my kids can walk 5 minutes to a school where they get the kind of a Jewish education, whereas I had to take a bus for, I don't know, a half hour every day to go to a school where I could get a Jewish education. I feel like that is definitely one of the perks of living in Israel. I feel very fortunate. That my kids are learning in their very, regular school about Chagim. They're learning Mishnah, they're learning Halacha. And that's just part of the curriculum. I mean, they're in a religious school, right? We're in the religious system as opposed to that. There are two main systems in the non-Haredi, non-Arab world, in non-Arab Israeli school system. There's the Mamlechti system, the national system, and the Mamlechti Dati, the national religious system. They're in the latter. And for the most part, it's been really good for them, and we feel really fortunate that they have exposure and that they're learning so much of what they're learning. But yes, I definitely think we do at times have to correct for feminism and fill in a lot of the gaps in terms of the literary references that we want our kids to to get that otherwise they would have no exposure to.
Okay. All right. So we're getting toward the end of our time. And are there any things you'd like to share with us? You know, now that it's what, 7 years since you wrote the book, and, you know, you're getting lots of people reading it, lots of questions about it. And are there any things that you'd like to share with us, or any thoughts that you have as you're finishing the second cycle of Daf Yomi? And I think we are all in awe of your ability to do this with 5 children, and to actually manage to take notes on it, and to spend as much time on it as you clearly do. So
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you know, the sticking to it, the fact that I have persevered with the Daf Yomi, I think I'm not sure that necessarily reflects a good part of my personality. I think it's kind of like my addictive side, the part of me that tends to get addicted and be a little bit extreme about things. But I am you know, I find it hard to stop, to break off commitments, and I will prioritize Daf Yomi above, you know, taking a shower, or, you know, other things that maybe other people would think are more important. I don't know what to do in a given day, but if there's only so much time, you know, I'd rather learn the daf than take a shower, you know, for example. But I think part of the trick to staying with Daf Yomi, if it's something you want to do or are doing, I think it's about being flexible with what it means to learn the daf. Over the course of my years of Daf Yomi, and now it's been, I guess, about 14 years now, I've learned the daf in many different ways. You know, I try always to read from the Gemara, but there were times when the twins were born, I started listening to podcasts for the first time, and using that as a way of like, suddenly like listening to a podcast could count as learning the daf, which, you know, would have been anathema to me when I first started. You know, like, what? How could that be? But I, you know, I've learned, you know, they say in Chazal say in Masechet Tanit, Le'olam yehei adam kal kekaneh ve'al yeh kasher ke'erez. I think like a person should always be pliant and soft like a reed, and not be hard like a cedar tree. And I take that to mean that you should, right? What happens when a strong wind blows? A reed will just bend over and then straighten back up again when the wind passes. What happens if a wind knocks over a cedar tree, right? You're not going to be able to replant that cedar tree. And I think that's a very powerful message for me about sort of, if you want to continue, right? You can't be so strict with yourself. You're never going to be able to read. You're not always going to be able to read every Rashi and every daf. There will be days you can, but not every day. And if you insist on reading every Rashi and every daf, then you're going to fall hopelessly behind and give up, right? So I think it's sort of the ability to be flexible in a way. Kind of ironically, I think the way I've learned that being flexible with Daf Yomi has also enabled me to be flexible in other aspects of my life. So I suppose that's a good takeaway, for me at least. But at this point, I really feel like, you know, it would be very, very hard for me to imagine my life without the daily study of Talmud. On days when I don't learn, it really feels like I kind of have, like, you have that feeling of like, did I not brush my teeth today? Like something feels off, you know? It's like, in a way, it's almost become like davening for me. There are days when I feel like Daf Yomi, it's like that thing you just have to check off the list. Like, you don't have to do it great, but you just got to do it. And you got to put that check, you know, it's got to get done. And I almost said you have to put that V, and then I realized, I see that's me thinking in like, you know, anglicized Hebrew, where a V is a check. But anyway, never mind. That's how they say check in Hebrew, a V. It's kind of funny because we don't say that in English. Never mind. Anyway, but yeah, you know, but yeah. So in a way, the Daf Yomi has become kind of like a ritual thing for me, like something one just has to get through, regardless of one's kavanah, regardless of, it's the keva, not the kavanah, right? It's the doing it every day, not sort of how much you're getting out of it. And even if you don't get anything out of it, the fact that you've done it, even if you just read through the daf and understood very little, right? That still counts for something. And so I think that's something I try to hold on to. And now, especially during our whole pandemic, when you know, now I said we're in another lockdown. We had a very long lockdown in the spring. There were so many days where I just felt so frustrated by how hard it was to get anything done whatsoever. And, you know, at the end of the day, I would just look back and say, what do I have to show for myself other than a sink full of dirty dishes, you know? And then I would say to myself, okay, but I learned the daf, at least that. It was like the one thing I could hold on to, even if nothing else got done today, at least I learned the daf. So in that sense, it really has been a lifeline for me. And I feel very grateful that I have that continuity. We learned all of we began Masechet Shabbat really with the outbreak of the pandemic, and it's a very long Masechet. It's about, I think it's 157 pages. So, that's about 5 months of learning, right? If you do a daf a day. And it really coincided with the pandemic. And for me, I wrote a lot about this. The whole pandemic experience really felt like a protracted period of Shabbat, of, resting, staying put, desisting from so much of what we would otherwise be doing, where we can't go out with, the things we usually go out with, right? And the whole experience of going out becomes very fraught, as it is on Shabbat, certainly in the biblical Shabbat, right? And so I feel very fortunate that I've had. I guess I'll say this in both ways. I feel very fortunate that I've had the daf to help me process the very difficult period that we're going through globally at this time. And I feel very fortunate that I've had the pandemic to furnish me with new metaphors for understanding Masechet Shabbat.
Wow. That's an amazing way of looking at the pandemic and of Daf Yomi. That's, I have to think about that. Wow. So it is time to wrap up, and we are still getting questions. Just so you know, people want to know how long it takes you to learn a page. And people want your recommendations as a translator on Israeli literature. So we're getting lots and lots and lots of these questions. And if you're okay with that, if we continue to get questions, we may send you some email and hope that you will respond to us going forward.
Of course. I can answer on one foot about how long it takes if you want. I don't know if.
Sure.
It varies very widely. It really takes as long as you can give it. At a bare minimum, it's very important to me to just read the daf and read the. I read the Stein here. These versions, like the Steinsaltz Perush, which is not all that long. It's, a little bit longer than Rashi, usually heavily based on Rashi. So it's as long as it takes me to read the Gemara and read Steinsaltz. That's a bare minimum for me. It really depends on the length of the daf. But what I do try to do is I try to listen to a podcast to review. And I listen to a podcast that's called Daf Yomi for Women. It's an excellent podcast. It's not only for women. It shouldn't be called Daf Yomi for Women. It's taught by a woman in Ra'anana. And she gives a really excellent, concise, about a 40-minute share. So I sometimes, if I feel like I had a good grasp of the daf, I'll even listen on 1.5 speed. Don't tell. I'm not telling this to all of you, but sometimes I do that. Not always. Also depends on the masechet. But anyway, but so usually it's about learning the daf, and then a few days later, I'm always behind on the listening, but I try to listen to a shir as review. That's how long it takes, I guess.
I'm impressed. There are days where I know that I just read it and say, okay, that's got to be it for the day.
Right. Yeah.
So we thank you that this has been really wonderful. The feedback we've gotten on the book has been really amazing, that people very much enjoyed it. And we know that you teach at the conservative yeshiva. So some of our people have taken advantage of the online learning with you that's taking place now. And we hope that we will be able to continue a relationship with you. And we look forward to your future writings and to seeing, where you go with all of this. So I also want to acknowledge and tell you that this is a program that was originated with MERCAZ USA, but we're now working with MERCAZ Canada and with the Israel Forever Foundation. And we have the director of MERCAZ Canada, Rabbi Jennifer Gorman, on, and the president of MERCAZ USA, Marilyn Wind, is on. And this has been, I hope everybody has really enjoyed it and that we can work together going forward. So we thank you very much. We wish everybody a Gemar Hatima Tova, and hope that next time we meet, the world will be in a better place and certainly healthier.
Amen. Gemar Hatima Tova. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.